In the winter of 1862, thousands of Texans were fighting far from home, north of the Red River, beyond familiar roads, in a land of steep ridges and frozen creeks. They knew why they had taken up arms. They understood what was at stake, and they carried those convictions with them as they marched into the Ozarks. The journey was unforgiving. Snow fell heavily. Freezing rain soaked uniforms and equipment. Food was scarce, and horses collapsed along icy roads. Yet the Texans pressed on, because they were told this march would open the way back into Missouri, that a single hard blow would undo months of retreat. That speed and resolve would decide the campaign. What they encountered instead, on a remote Arkansas ridge near a small country inn called Elkhorn Tavern, was one of the largest and most consequential battles ever fought west of the Mississippi River. Its outcome would quietly determine the future of the Trans-Mississippi Confederacy. This was the Battle of Pea Ridge. And this is the story of the Texans who fought there. By the summer of 1861, Texans were already fighting far from home. They had crossed the Red River, moved north through Indian Territory in Arkansas, and entered Missouri at a time when the future of that state was still uncertain. Missouri was divided, heavily armed, and strategically vital. Control of it meant control of rivers, railroads, and access into the Deep South. Among the Texans who marched north was the 3rd Texas Cavalry, a regiment that would later play a central role at Pea Ridge. They were not raw recruits. Many had already seen combat. In August of 1861, the 3rd Texas Cavalry fought at Wilson's Creek, near Springfield, Missouri. It was one of the first major battles of the war in the West, and a Confederate victory. For the Texans, Wilson's Creek was a hard introduction to large-scale fighting. They learned quickly what combat meant: confusion, noise, fear, and loss. They also learned that Union armies could be beaten. The victory mattered. It reinforced Confederate confidence in Missouri and convinced many Texans that, with aggressive leadership, the Union could be pushed completely out of the state. But victory at Wilson's Creek also exposed deep cracks within the Confederate high command. The Confederate commanders responsible for Wilson's Creek did not agree on what should come next. Sterling Price believed the Union Army was beaten and vulnerable. He wanted to press north and drive Federal forces completely out of Missouri. Ben McCulloch disagreed. His army was poorly supplied, unevenly trained, and operating far from reliable support. He believed caution, not pursuit, was the safer course. The disagreement hardened into resentment. Price accused McCulloch of wasting a victory. McCulloch believed Price was reckless and politically motivated. The dispute followed both men into the fall and winter of 1861, shaping every major decision west of the Mississippi. While Confederate leaders argued, Union forces recovered, and Texans were ordered south. After Wilson's Creek, the 3rd Texas Cavalry withdrew with McCulloch's command into northwestern Arkansas. By late fall, the regiment went into winter quarters near Bentonville. For the men, it was an uneasy pause. They drilled when weather allowed. They repaired equipment. They waited. They believed Missouri was not lost, only postponed. But the 3rd Texas would not remain alone for long. During the fall of 1861, other Texas cavalry units began arriving to reinforce McCulloch's command. From North and Central Texas came the 6th Texas Cavalry, raised by Colonel Barton W. Stone of Dallas. Nearly 1,000 strong when organized, the regiment crossed Indian Territory and reported to McCulloch in October. Shortly afterward arrived the 9th Texas Cavalry, organized by Colonel William B. Sims. Recruited in North Texas, the regiment had already endured hard service in Indian Territory before reaching Arkansas. By the time it joined McCulloch, its numbers were reduced, but its experience was not. In mid-October, the 11th Texas Cavalry, led by Colonel William C. Young, crossed the Red River. 850 men strong, it represented Cook County and surrounding areas. Men who had traveled hundreds of miles to reach a war that seemed to keep moving away from them. Completing the group was John W. Whitfield's Texas Legion, a battalion of mounted riflemen recruited from South and East Texas. By early 1862, it would be redesignated the 27th Texas Cavalry. Together, these units formed the strongest cavalry force west of the Mississippi, and they would soon be tested. Winter in Arkansas was harsh. Most Texans lacked proper winter clothing. Many slept without adequate blankets. Food was irregular, and foraging became routine. Yet for all its hardship, winter quarters provided something rare in wartime: time. McCulloch reorganized his command. Officers drilled their men. New units were integrated. Among the cavalry was a young officer named Lawrence Sullivan Saul Ross, a major in the 9th Texas Cavalry. During January and February of 1862, Ross served as a scout, riding ahead of Confederate columns, observing Union movements, and learning the roads and ridges of the Ozarks. Ross later recalled that the terrain itself dictated the fighting: steep hills, narrow valleys, and wooded ridges that made coordination difficult and surprise unreliable. He was learning the ground where Texans would soon fight. In January 1862, Confederate authorities attempted to impose order. As a result of the Confederate Arkansas and Missouri regiments' inability to agree, Major General Earl Van Dorn, a notorious ladies' man who was shot dead by a jealous husband in May 1863, was placed in overall command of the Trans-Mississippi District. After taking command, Van Dorn combined the feuding Southern armies into the Army of the West, setting up headquarters in Pocahontas in northeastern Arkansas. Van Dorn believed speed could solve every problem. He believed Missouri could still be reclaimed. And he believed Texans would make the difference. McCulloch returned from Richmond, his dispute with Sterling Price unresolved, his authority fragile, but his cavalry intact. By February, Union General Samuel Curtis was advancing south. Van Dorn chose not to retreat. The Texans were ordered forward, but they were already on the road to Pea Ridge. On the night of March 6, 1862, the Army of the West began its final movement toward battle. General Van Dorn intended to march around the Union flank, cut its supply line, and force a decisive engagement. The plan depended on speed, but there was one big problem. It didn't account for darkness, exhaustion, or terrain. Texans marched through narrow Ozark roads in freezing conditions. Wagons stalled. Units became separated. Orders moved slowly, or not at all. Major Lawrence Sullivan Ross, scouting ahead for General McCulloch, later recalled that the country itself worked against coordination. Ridges and wooded hollows, breaking columns apart and making communication difficult. By dawn, much of the Confederate Army was out of position. March 7th began, not with a coordinated assault, but with confusion. Texas cavalrymen dismounted and moved into dense timber. Visibility was limited. Sound traveled poorly. Officers struggled to locate neighboring units. A trooper of the 3rd Texas Cavalry later recalled that men often fired toward sound rather than sight, unsure whether friendly units were nearby. Orders, when they came, were fragmentary. Still, the Texans advanced. The Texans, under McCulloch's wing, pressed forward against Union skirmishers. The fighting was close and uneven. Men fought from behind trees, rocks, and fallen timber. Units surged forward, then stalled, then advanced again. Ross, riding between positions, observed that the ground prevented any clear sense of the larger battle. Each regiment fought its own fight. Shortly after midday, the battle turned. General Ben McCulloch, moving forward to assess the situation, rode into the edge of the timber. Moments later, he was shot and killed. The loss was immediate and devastating. Command on the Confederate right collapsed in succession. Senior officers fell or became isolated. Orders ceased. Texans did not know McCulloch was dead. Only that coordination had vanished. A member of the 6th Texas Cavalry later wrote that the firing continued without direction, as though the army had lost its head, but not its limbs. By afternoon, the focus of the battle shifted toward Elkhorn Tavern, a key crossroads anchoring the Union defensive line. Texas units advanced again and again, pressing Union forces back toward the tavern. A trooper of the 3rd Texas Cavalry later recalled that men believed victory was near, that the enemy was giving way, but the Confederates were stretched thin. Ammunition was running low. Artillery support was uneven. Ross later noted that without McCulloch, no one coordinated the attack. Each regiment fought bravely, but alone. As darkness fell, the Texans held ground near Elkhorn Tavern. They had advanced, but they were exhausted. That night, Texans slept where they stood, cold, hungry, uncertain. Few understood what the next day would bring. March 8th dawned cold and gray. Union artillery opened fire early, and with devastating effect. Texas units, already short on ammunition, could not respond in kind. A soldier of the 3rd Texas Cavalry later recalled that the sound of Union guns dominated the morning, leaving Confederate infantry and cavalry pinned in place. Texans held as long as they could, but courage could not replace shells. Ross later wrote that the retreat was not a rout, but a recognition of reality. The Army could not continue the fight. Lyman Bennett, an officer in the 36th Illinois, vividly described the savage battle that raged in the woods.
Great God, what a scene is presented. The mangled trunks of men are thickly scattered around. From each tree or sheltering rock, the groans of the wounded arise. Muskets, saddles, horses, blankets, hats, and clothes hang on every bush, or in gory manner strew the ground. And now in the valley to the right, 10,000 wild cheers proclaim the victory ours. Dead horses, dead men, and dismounted guns are strewed over the blood-drenched field.
As the Confederate Army withdrew, Texans formed much of the rear guard. They fought delaying actions. They protected wagons. They carried wounded. A member of the 11th Texas Cavalry later recalled that the withdrawal was slow and deliberate, marked by constant skirmishing. Texans did not break. They fell back, step by step. By midday, the Battle of Pea Ridge was over. The battle was over. For the men who fought there, the cost was immediate and personal. Friends were missing. Comrades lay wounded. Others would not answer roll call again. As the numbers were counted, Texans began to understand what Pea Ridge had taken from them. The Confederate Army withdrew south into Arkansas, intact, but changed. It had fought hard. It had not broken, but it had failed to hold the field. For many Texans, Pea Ridge felt different from Wilson's Creek. There was no sense of opportunity lost, only the realization of limits. Major Lawrence Sullivan Ross would later reflect that Pea Ridge marked the end of Confederate hopes in Missouri, not because the men had failed, but because leadership and coordination had collapsed at a critical moment. The soldiers had done what was asked of them. They had marched, they had fought, they had held as long as they could. Texans would fight on, at Galveston, Sabine Pass, and at Mansfield, along the Red River. But after Pea Ridge, the war west of the Mississippi became a defensive one. The initiative was gone. What remained were the men, and the memory of a cold ridge in northwest Arkansas, where many of them learned for the first time what the war would truly demand.